Thank you, Rajesh, for laying out the vision of the RBI Innovation Hub. And you are in the right position to implement many of these ideas, and I hope you achieve great success in this vision. Our last session for the day is a wide-ranging conversation on the future of India's digital transformation. It is set up as a conversation between Sahil Kini, co-founder and chief executive officer of Setu from Bengaluru, and Asha Jadeja Motwani, the founder of Motwani Jadeja Foundation from Silicon Valley, which is America's Bengaluru. It will be moderated by Mridul Sharma, investment promotion officer at Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology at Government of India. Yes, please.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the next session. So the theme of the session, as mentioned, the future of India's digital transformation. So COVID-19 pandemic has catalyzed the pace of digitalization and technology adoption in India and across the world. The India Stack, as discussed before, a layered API structure created through a public-private partnership, was a driver of the first wave of digitalization in the country. The session will explore the opportunities and the possible routes forward for the next step in India's blooming digital economy, from investments to data to emerging technologies. We'll be exploring everything. To introduce you, we have Ms. Asha Jadeja Motwani, founder of Motwani Jadeja Foundation, a philanthropist, angel investor, and an NFT evangelist. With a wide array of investment experience and of launching Rajiv Circle Fellowship to help Indian entrepreneurs connect worldwide. Thank you, Asha ma'am, for joining us today. We have with us Mr. Sahil Kini. Mr. Sahil Kini is the co-founder and CEO at Setu, a Bangalore-based startup that offers API infrastructure for financial services. Setu's mission is to accelerate economic growth by making formal finance accessible to all. I'll now hand over to Sahil to start off with what Setu exactly is and what are they trying to achieve.
Is the microphone working? I hope so. Thank you so much, Mridul. I run a company called Setu. I didn't mean to start off with a self-promotion, but hey, you opened the gates, so why not, right? What we do is very simple and at the same time quite nuanced. We build plumbing for the financial ecosystem, for fintechs. The whole idea being that to make financial services accessible to, say, 50 crore Indians, 60 crore Indians. And today, they might be 500, 600 million or 50, 60 crore Indians with a bank account, but the penetration of formal financial services is absurdly low. Our household debt to GDP ratio is 12% when the global average is 60%. Our insurance penetration rate is 3.5%. Global average is twice that. Until about a year ago, we only had about 2 crore demat accounts. That has doubled in the last year, which is nice to see, but it's still tiny when it comes to overall penetration. The whole idea is, fundamental belief is Lakshmi belongs in every home and everyone should have access to affordable credit. Everyone should have access to insurance that matters. Everybody should have access to investment products that make sense for them. And the idea is that the formal banking system and the distribution architecture of, let's say, bank branches makes it such that you can't profitably serve even lower middle class and poor people. And that ends up accounting for 80 to 90 crores or 800 or 900 million people in this country. And so you're moving distribution from branch-based distribution to app-based distribution. You're able to reduce the cost of distribution by a factor, I would say maybe 50%. Right? So if the cost of physically sourcing a loan was about 1,500 rupees or roughly about $25, you're able to bring it down to half that, which means that the number of people that you can profitably address increases. Now, instead of having to physically go to a bank branch, you can go to an app and get a loan. But instead of you having to even digitally go to an app, if the bank's products were embedded into every single application contextually, you see that happening, for example, with buy now, pay later at a checkout. Now, that's a very um, uh, that's a segment targeted towards like the top 100 million people in the country. But I think you're going to see a mode where fintech becomes omnipresent in each and every application. And to do that, you need to build connecting infrastructure between regulated financial institutions and third-party applications so that you can get those kind of products from wherever you are. And that kind of connecting infrastructure is what Setu builds, with the express purpose of like making financial inclusion possible, and hopefully building a valuable company in the process. This would not have been possible without the India stack. And electronic KYC, electronic signatures, DigiLocker, UPI, GSTN, these are all critical pieces of infrastructure that makes this kind of transition possible. And I'm very excited, for example, about what Mr. Bansal spoke about in his keynote, which is the power of unlocking data. Because for a lot of people, credit has been traditionally driven by asset-based loans. Most loans in this country are asset-backed: loan against property, loan against gold, loan against your cow. All of this is how India gets credit. But there is a massive transformation coming, which is instead of getting loan against your assets, you can get credit against your data, against your cash flow data, how much money you're making, what kind of business you're in. The more they know about you, the easier it is to gauge willingness and ability to repay. And I think democratizing credit is a fundamental driver of growth in this country. And I think to do that, you've got to democratize data. And that, I believe, will be the next wave of disruption. There's already a framework called the Account Aggregator Framework, which will allow users and even small businesses to be able to share their cash flow data and share their transaction information with lenders, which will make it possible for you to get small ticket credit, which was probably much harder to do earlier. Because the distribution cost was high, the user friction was high, the ability, the ease with which, everyone asks you for a bank statement when you're asking for a loan. Imagine making that as easy as entering a PIN and it's done. Right? So there is a lot of innovation coming up, which I believe will democratize credit, democratize financial services, and take it to our people beyond the 100, 150, 200 million people who are primarily English speaking, relatively well off, and permanently call themselves middle class, but are not, to the next 500, 700 million people. And those people are I think, the real asset that we've got. If we keep operating like this, we will look like a medium-sized European country and not like ourselves. And I think building for ourselves will play a major role. So sorry about the long rant, but I thought I should just finish off there.
Thank you for that. We actually saw Pine Labs using the same data at the POS, the source, and then becoming a very quick unicorn in just a few months. Asha ma'am, over to you. I would just like to understand from your experience, how could we enhance collaboration between the Silicon Valley of the East and our own valley in the West, Bangalore? How do we synergize both the ecosystem? How do we enhance?
Question. The synergy is already there, Mridul. I think there's a lot of, those of us who are in the valley, we are coming here to the US all the time, and as a result, somehow, there has also been, apart from just coming from family events, now people have started investing as angels. I've started doing that for the last about a decade now. And so I'm beginning to get to know the ecosystem here. I think where there is room for expansion there, or for strengthening of this corridor, I think is really in the government participation. So I'll give you a few examples. One of the things that I discovered in my visits to the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas every year, it's millions of people are there, and every country is represented. Multiple hardware startups are there. One of the things I noticed as I was walking around in Consumer Electronics Show a few years ago was that there were pavilions for every country. Every small dinky little country, Azerbaijan, Chile, Argentina, and the one that was conspicuously missing was India. And I was actually quite surprised because, how is it that the government's not spending that money that we have allocated for expansion, for globalization purposes, or for startups? Is that it has to be invested in creating that linkage to global markets. And this is not just about government using Indian taxpayer money for establishing that link, but it has to know that this is a profitable investment. In having, for example, that One India pavilion in the Consumer Electronics Show, we'll have an ROI which I guarantee would be more than 10x. So what we did as Motwani Foundation was we actually just created our own pavilion. We called it the Motwani India Pavilion, and tons of startups came from India. They were sitting in this India Pavilion, and a lot of them, because of that connection. Frankly, here's what I did personally: is I actually flew in a few people from India, and it's 20, 30 kids, with their own little and they would come there and they would rent an Airbnb, and in Vegas, and if they're plunged in for about a week in the Consumer Electronics Show, the amount of acceleration that's happening there is phenomenal. So I think that the one of the things that I was mentioning to you even before this conversation right now is that we in India need to start calling government funds. We should stop using the word government funds. It is your Indian taxpayer money. When I ask my relatives, I'm like, why do you not say it's taxpayer money? They say, well, because we don't pay taxes. Sure. But the thing is that if you buy soap or shampoo or shoes or petrol, then you are an Indian taxpayer. So I think if there is that mindset difference, then I think what we will start doing is we will start asking for those thousands of crores which are sitting there, often unused, for the purpose of accelerating the bottom of the pyramid also. And a lot of the people that we took to these various programs, including Makerfest New York and things like that, a lot of these kids, Sahil, you'll be happy to hear, they were from second and third tier cities. I mean, I had people from Meerut and so on showing up in New York City and showcasing their inventions there. So if somebody like me who has very little capacity, if I can do it, Indian government should absolutely do it. So I think that's the way forward. And I've spoken to the Consul General in San Francisco about this. He's totally open to it. I think when do we get the gears moving is the question.
I believe that has already started somehow, though I love the point. We have recently seen these emerging technologies and small startups intervening into big events, especially in India. That's a first step forward. And that happens to be a big networking ground and a major market access opportunity. Medi Startup Hub per se have recently done an Indo-French, Indo-German collaboration as well as an Indo-Saudi. Now to anchor on the Indo-German specifically, we are looking forward on collaborating not the startups but the incubators per se, because that would have a long-term effect.
The question, sir, though, Mridul, is that, remember, we don't have Indian diaspora in these countries. So Germany and France is a trickle. You go to US, it's run by Indians largely now. So it's absolutely normal and natural. So whether you go in medicine, technology, of course, we all know that Indians are playing a huge role. And I'm talking about not just the CEOs, I'm talking about engineers who are 50-60% of some of these large companies, but in medical establishments, hospitals, White House, there are Indians everywhere. So because the Indian diaspora is so strongly rooted in the United States, it's critical that India invest that time and effort into creating that corridor with the US, which it is. I think that some things are going, it's cooking. I know that something is cooking there. It'll happen. But it needs to be accelerated because there is a lot of momentum right now and the time is right now for us to have that,
Definitely. Adding to it, ma'am, just one more question on top of it. Challenges of US accelerators to accelerate Indian startup ecosystem, or let's say the understanding of ease of doing business or the perception of why do accelerators or investors feel that there might be a hesitation while entering in the Indian ecosystem?
Indian accelerators there is no such thing as American incubators. In the sense that startups or entrepreneurs are homegrown. They normally emerge from a bedroom or a garage or grandma's living room. or a university dorm. I have not seen any US company, a big company, coming out from an incubator. So I think the money that the Indian taxpayer money that the government might be spending on incubators here could be for more for the sort of, I think for impact technologies or for distributing technologies into, the last mile, could be for that. But I think as far as US incubators or accelerators, there are very few. There are things like Y Combinator, and you're right about those things which are very good, but they don't necessarily have to come here for that. I mean, if you look at the current last 3 years cohorts of Y Combinator or Alchemist, which are based in the US now, large percentage of the cohorts is Indian actually. There's a lot of Indian startups that apply from here. They get selected, and then they are required to work on certain programs of something like the Y Combinator. So that's already happening. There is no reluctance, by the way. As far as US investors, angel investors, or Indian diaspora goes, we know that this is where the action is. The Indian startup world is where the action is. Everybody is here, already there. I think the only fear that that sometimes people have is about certain rules and regulations. You want to have, there has to be certain certainty of rule of law. For example, you cannot have a police action against a startup or a board member who may not comply with certain regulation. If a Twitter doesn't comply with something, it should be slapped with a financial penalty. But you can't have police showing up into a Twitter office. So these are minor, I think, well, major, I guess, from Twitter's perspective. But we don't want those kind of regulations to scare away people that want to be in India. So I think that's where I see possibilities of so the action is already happening, Mridul. I'm not worried about that. I think two or three regulations, if they are cleaned up, we'll have a floodgate opening to India.
I'd like to also kind of talk about, when you're talking about capital coming in, for the most part, we keep talking about foreign capital coming in. There's a lot of domestic capital as well. And like you said, taxpayer funds. A large part of this was allocated to a very large fund of funds. I don't recall what the actual amount was. I think it was north of 50,000 crores or something like that, right? There was a fund of funds where the Indian government had, as a part of Startup India, to invest into startups in the country. I'm not sure how much of that money has actually made it to startups. I think part of the reason is the way those funds are governed, where you'll allocate a large amount, tens of thousands of crores, and then you will get a committee from, might as well name names, SIDBI or something like that, where it's a quasi-governmental organization, and then there's a form and a process and a checklist and God knows what else to actually raise funds. Whereas early stage companies look very different. Early stage companies are, chaotic good in some sense. It's changing all the time. I think if we were to adopt a model similar to what Singapore did, where the sovereign funds are managed by professional management, like with GIC or Temasek in some sense, and they're able to generate tremendous returns, and they're also able to deploy large amounts of capital efficiently and create a lot of wealth for the nation of Singapore, which is something that we just don't do. And I think, I'm a fourth generation businessman, Asha. My great grandfather, father, all were businessmen. And this, at least there's still a hangover. Maybe startups are changing that. But India wasn't a country that trusted businessmen for a very long time. Very, very long time. If you were in business, it was almost always you'd get a side-eyed look. You're not educated, if you're a professor, you get a lot of respect. If you're a businessman, maybe not that much, unless you are, a large corporate house like the Tatas, for example. And I think that's changing. But there is still, kind of like an implicit hangover of who are you? Why? Explain yourself. There's more a sense of, for example, the whole angel tax fiasco that happened, which has a lot of, these are small companies. All they need to be doing is focusing on building innovative things. not dancing around regulation, not worrying about who will come after them. And certainly they should be having access to a lot more domestic capital to accelerate our own journey. And makes sense to put money in the early stages. Because look, that money is not there to generate a return. That money is there to foster innovation. And you should be willing to see some of that money go away because it's risky. It's a risky asset class. And I think that understanding is not there.
With startups getting so much visibility though, Sahil, do you see that changing? Do you see that, I mean, would your uncle or aunt say, okay, hey Sahil, you're doing a startup. This is great, right? I mean, do you see that something changing, you know?
I do see that. Well, my uncle and my family is no reference because they're all business people, and that's what tends to happen, right? I mean, business families are a thing. It's more to see, when two doctors have a daughter who goes and starts a company. How is that taken? And I think that is changing. I think there is a lot more awareness. There is a lot more. But the issue there is, for the most part, I'd say like 90% of successful startup founders and startup founders in general, I think, are essentially my college children. We are all very anglicized. We're all, we wear shirt, pant, we sit in AC rooms, we all talk to each other in English. We've forgotten who we are, or at least where we come from. And so you'll see that all the products that are being built for the same 150, 200 million people that are there. And there's no design that is truly being done for the masses. And that's something that bothers me tremendously. I mean, I know that there are lots of frontiers of innovation that we should go on, and I know we should talk about crypto, for example. I don't think it's just the government's job. I mean, I think it's fundamentally, I believe, I mean, we might disagree here, and I do think it is the government's job to do it, but I don't think it's just the government's job. I subscribe to a point of view that says that it's incumbent on the best of us to serve the rest of us. And if we've had the privilege of, I've had the privilege of being born a man in this country, that in itself is a privilege. And then being born relatively well off, studied in a government institution which is considered very, very, in IIT, and then move on. All of that, everyone's invested in me. So it's. I feel like I feel an obligation to build something that does that serves. And serves more than just the people who are already very well served. The government definitely plays a role, and I think for like the bottom 600 million people, it's very difficult to build a business model that'll scale, because there just isn't enough money in their household. So what margin will you extract out of that? Right. So there definitely, I think subsidies, the government, Sarkar is Bhagwan happens for that reason. But I think there are two levels of innovation. One is breaking the floor, and the other is breaking the ceiling. Breaking the ceiling is more about frontier tech like crypto or quantum computing or all of that. All gene editing, all this stuff that is happening right now, and we have some of the best minds in the world on it. And then breaking the floor is about inclusiveness, increasing access to those technologies. And I think both need to happen for us to lift ourselves from being very poor, which is also something that we don't admit often enough.
Sahil, one answer and one question. First of all, I completely agree. It's a government job to make a sustainable, inclusive ecosystem as well. Though I love that you have an insight that it's also your responsibility because these are privileges and you should live a life of service. That's a brilliant view to have about life. So there happens to be, like in specific cases where I believe, many a times it doesn't make economic sense to make something which might have a wider impact on society. In such cases, there definitely requires an intervention from the government angle to provide or to scale such intervention. Let's say we see many state initiatives coming up. We have recently seen the AP Markfed, the Andhra Pradesh government coming up with a brilliant technology solution and dashboarding for the entire farming scenario. And that can now be scaled up on a large scale for a very socially inclusive model, as stated before. But the brilliant point that I saw there, and a question to both of you, would be the exposure of the problem statement to the ecosystem, because now everybody has an understanding of what exactly is happening. So the mentorship, it's usually on the journey that people realize that what is the bigger problem that they're actually trying to solve. They start with something else. They don't have an understanding that what problems do really exist because of the place or the perspective where they're coming from.
Want to go first?
Yeah, you know, Asha's point around increasing exposure, I think, is key, right? Only when you go out, if you're in a small town, when you come to a big city, your world opens up. And then if you're from a big city in India and then you go to some place like New York and you see that the world is even bigger and there are all these new ideas. And it's very hard to, there's an energy to a place where things are being built. There is a community when things are being built where people are solving problems together. So I think what you're doing by kind of taking young entrepreneurs and putting them in these new environments where they can rapidly scale up is tremendous, because that's invaluable, and it's not learning that you can get even on these days people are fond of saying you can learn anything on the internet. Maybe you can learn most things, but learning how New York feels, or what the people there are like, or how they treat you, and how conversations around money happen. These are all lived experiences that you can't get through a YouTube video, and delivering that, I think, is a service that is very commendable.
Sahil, it's actually pretty easy sometimes to, what I started doing was, to your question as to how do you find those people? How do you get them to understand what needs to be done, right, for young people? In fact, we have about 250 fellows now in our own Motwani Foundation. And the youngest one was about 8 when we first started. And he was in Kerala, in Kochi. And what we do is we look for problem solvers. We look for young kids, entrepreneurs who are problem solving in their own community in a small way. So for example, this 8-year-old that we found, he had created a robot for his mom to clean the house. But look at the feeling, right, where he's coming from. By now he's almost 15, and he's created so many things. He's actually got a certification from the Fab Academy at MIT, and he's using Fab Labs now, which are these enormously powerful fabrication labs that are now set up. I set up a couple in Ahmedabad and then Kochi, and then there were some more in the Kerala government setup. But what I'm saying is that if we look for those problem solvers, they are natural entrepreneurs. And what we do is most of them don't have a passport, of course, So we actually get passports for them, and we now have a well-oiled machine. I'll tell you more about this someday. But a well-oiled machine where we get them the visas. The visa offices now know us, and they give us 5 and 10-year multiple entry. All we do, believe it or not, is just literally schlep them there. 90% of the value is in getting them there. And sometimes I used to like to believe that I was making a difference as a mentor, but it was now in hindsight, after 8 or 9 years of doing this, that's really very little. I think it was just the fact that you are plunging somebody who's never been exposed to other things, and into just San Francisco and into Taikon. I used to actually throw them into Taikon to see that there is a whole sea of 5,000 other brown people who are right there in the thick of Silicon Valley, running and creating, being the DNA of some of the most important tech companies. That alone is such a game changer for these kids. So it's totally possible to find these problem solvers in every little village. What I see, Sahil and Mridul and all of you, is that what I'm doing is just a pilot. But these pilots are what we are trying to showcase to the government, because government has the money. And it is sitting on it, and it's, once again, please remember, this is Indian taxpayer money. It's your money. You have to ask the government to scale up these pilots that have worked well. So, and I hope you will do that, Mridul. You are with MIT, so thank you.
We're definitely taking inspiration, and the knowledge regarding the Fab Labs would definitely be really helpful. Now, coming to the audience questions, and a very appropriate one, the huge demand-supply gap when it comes to tech talent. And what interventions do we believe on upskilling or building a tech talent pool? We have also seen, like, with the new virtual workforce coming into the picture, probably the Indian talent might as well just be housed in India, and they could still work everywhere. And other than that, let's say we're seeing a lot many emerging technologies coming up. So what you believe could be great interventions, be it policy-wise or be it such pilot projects that could actually solve this demand-supply gap in the talent space?
I think there is not a whole lot to be done. I think if you look at what's happening with smart kids, first of all, English is critical, as Sahil was saying just now. That right now we are only 150 or 200 million of us, right, who speak English. But so if we have a deeper reach of English into into the last mile in India, I think we'll see an explosion of that talent learning by itself. What's really fantastic, as you can see from the crypto world, right? The crypto world right now is dominated by Indian programmers. And why is that so? Because they had access to the internet and they had, data and they had, they were English speaking. So if that small sample from the crypto world can show us that this can get, an escape velocity of its own, I think we can easily do that if our, kids in less, advantaged areas have access to the internet, to English and things like that. These days, there's so much learning that can happen online that really we don't need to be teaching things and so on. It's exposure and building a little bit of community for kids to really take off on their own. Talent here is phenomenal. In fact, I've even stumbled upon fantastic talent in Pakistan. And there you should see the challenges. If we have challenges here, there it's worse. So talent is there in every society. It just needs to be having a community and having access to the internet. So I hope that happens, and hopefully a little bit more English.
Speaking as someone who keeps looking for engineers all day and night, then that's half the thing I do in my company. I can tell you that the shortage for talent isn't necessarily a shortage. It's that the price has gone up for talent. It's gotten more expensive. And I think it's very fair that it has. I think the labor arbitrage model of the 90s and early 2000s when we were doing software services has changed. And in Indian developers are being recognized as some of the best in the world. And so you're going to have to pay almost global rates to get really, really good people. And that basically means that, so that's at least in the cities. So then you have to start looking further, right? To actually become a great developer, you've got to start actually writing code. And a lot of people coming out of universities haven't really spent that much time doing programming. I keep saying that code is the most expensive handmade thing in the world, the most valuable handmade thing in the world. It's all made by, it's karigari, it's craftsmanship. And so all karigars need to go through a period of apprenticeship. You don't become a craftsman without an apprenticeship. And so you are investing in those developers in the first couple of years when they're spending time with you. And if you're not willing to pay, you'll lose them when the next highest bidder comes. And so I don't think there's a shortage of people. I think you've got to know where to look, how much to pay, and how much to invest in these people to be able to. And if you're not willing to do that, then it'll feel like a shortage. At least that's my belief.
An interesting take, how I have seen many Indian kids growing up and then hustling their way into IITs and these great tech institutions. I usually see them running on a very constrained module of lifestyle, which just puts them on a very jugaad thought process. And when I see them working with tech giants per se, and they already have a code base or conditions outlined and a box to work around with, probably I see a correlation and a learning coming from those young years of that constrained ideology being executed on that boxed framework of algorithm style. Maybe. Now, I'll just call upon the physical audience for a few questions if they have any. Anybody from the audience? I do have the questions here. I just want to see the... Please, sir.
Hi, my name is Apur Kulkarni. I'm from Ola Mobility Institute. Wonderful discussion. I basically was wondering, we had some discussions about breaking the floor, etc. And often the people that we want to build products and services for don't have a seat at the table, especially in larger cities, etc. And I'm wondering if you guys have cracked the code on this in terms of how do you hear the voices of those who are not at the table, and right from women, persons with disabilities, and senior citizens, and what have you, because they do form a sizable number, but their needs may not be as well understood.
You have to go to them. You can't sit in your conference room in Bangalore or Silicon Valley or wherever it is and hypothesize in an ivory tower and assume that you'll build solutions that address their needs. That just doesn't work that way. We don't do enough primary user research. And it's typically outsourced to some agency. The people who are building for a particular set of people, a particular set of customers, have to go spend time with those customers. And unfortunately, it so happens that the top 150, 200 million people have more than 80 to 90% of the wealth of this country. So you can build great businesses just catering to the. If you just cater to the top 20 million people in this country, you can build a multi-billion-dollar company, as some of the more popular companies these days have demonstrated amply. So you've got to be really motivated to say that this is not just about the money. The money will come because there is scale, but it will take time, and you've got to have a long-term mindset. And I'm not entirely sure that the venture capital model of a 7 to 10 year investment cycle followed by an exit at that time is well suited to actually build that. I believe this is a 30, 40, 50 year time scale problem, and you've got to constantly be at it and go spend time with these people and say that we will represent them and build products for them that will create value over time. I don't think it's got to be done the hard way. There's no other shortcut.
There are a lot of NGOs that do it, by the way. You see things like, Akshay Patra, Pratham, some fantastic NGOs that are doing phenomenal work on the ground.
A follow-up question on the same as he answered. So, how do we promote more patient capital? Because we have seen the customer engagement going low, or the prioritization going towards profits rather than customer-centric approach. So how do we promote more patient capital in the ecosystem where the bigger funds are looking for early exits, and it has become a bootstrapping game altogether?
Patient capital is called government, which has literally billions of your taxpayer money. And that it has to be something that has to be put into work. A lot of times I hear my friends in India tell me that government funds allocated for things like quantum computing or AI and so on, they sit around. They are there, but they are not being spent. And it could be something like what Sahil was saying about we don't have those professional investors, right? So we do have, let's say if we have 50,000 crores sitting around for startups, these, that's patient capital that could be going to the last mile, it could be going to villages, could be going into smart cities and into startups in that ecosystem where they are not looking for returns in the next 8 years or 10 years. It could be looking for, it still is an investment, but the horizon is 20 to 30 years. So it's totally doable. I think how do we get that money to really reach smartly, to reach the last mile is the question. And I'm hoping you guys are all on top of that.
Definitely, ma'am. So on the mushrooming stage, I do have seen at the initial starting point that we do have a lot many grants. Let's say the entrepreneurship in residence, like helping entrepreneurs have a pocket expense. And then we have the product development. All of these are patient capital that we enable. But let's say in case of Ola, do you expect government intervening and private players at a higher round promoting patient capital? At the end of the day, will it just be, because on high impact rounds, I do believe that the government would be the anchor for such initiatives. And yes, for AI programs, we are seeing great initiatives such as the Moonshot or the Lighthouse projects that we call it. Again, the anchor for that question was specific towards these private players also losing out on the customer interaction or the customer satisfaction level because of unavailability of patient capital? Maybe we are on a different tangent altogether while we are discussing the same pointer. So, as per your answer, do you expect government to be intervening with Ola Mobility and supporting them with the patient capital?
Actually, Sahil, why don't you answer that? Because I'm not familiar with how
No,
the government interacts with startups here.
Neither am I for that matter, but because I don't think there really has been a, other than the events and all that, well, might as well be honest, I don't think there's been really sincere engagement other than income tax notices to angel investors and, where is the capital in startups? Where is it? Which government, I mean, there might be some few SIDBI deals here and there, but for the ocean of capital sitting there, where is it going into into these startups? Where are they on the cap table? They're not. I mean, let's be real. So certainly not going to happen in late stage, but I definitely think that, early stage investments in companies or in areas that are actually going to do, some meaningful work in, say, dairy and providing financing for dairy farmers, or, all those stats that you saw. 8% is in MSME financing. 8% of MSMEs have access to formal financing. Now, there is a large fund and there was an initiative, but has that money really reached the MSMEs? That follow-up is, we've always been bad at it as a nation. We've always been bad at it. It's not this government or that government. It's just, we need to get better. I'm not sure how. I think we need professional management. That's one approach. We might need something else.
No, but the question then for you, and maybe even for somebody like Sumit in the audience here, is that I know that the government has its heart in the right place. It wants to do good. Why is it so difficult for the government to let go of that money? Once again, we have to stop calling it government funds. We have to call it Indian taxpayer money. So why is it so difficult for the government, or for the government to give up what belongs to the people? Sumit, I'm going to put you on a spot here. He wants to be off the record. Okay. All right. Well, so I'm not fully sure. I think that is something that we need to really, I think that's where activism needs to happen, where you guys are the ones who need to be asking that question. And, this should be something that must have even some legal firepower to say that 50,000 crores, which is sitting there unspent, needs to, for tier 2 and tier 3 cities, why is it not being spent? That question has to be asked. And I think I do see a lot of people in government, circles who have the heart in the right place, and the funds might, be released if these tough questions are asked.
No, there's no question that the heart's in the right place. We just find it difficult to actually do it.
Given a small example, let's say, from the output of the entire conversation, if we look at, let's say, a fund of fund managed by private professional management, just like the Singapore model. And government says, okay, we are ready to help with 20% or 40% of the corpus size. In such a scenario, the remaining 60%, will the other players also be happy to have a 10-year, 12-year, 15-year patient capital? Or are you expecting that the 100% should be backed by the government?
There are several structures for permanent capital. Evergreen structures have existed for a very long time. Sequoia, which is one of the world's largest VC funds, have moved to a more long-term permanent structure capital structure. It's a function of scale. When you reach a certain scale, having a balance sheet that can turn over for a much longer period is a lot easier. So you need large-scale players. And by the way, for the sake of in the example of GIC, all the funds are taxpayer funds. All the funds are taxpayer funds. And so it's not like, 40% is Singapore government and 60% is some private players. It's not. And it's generating tremendous returns for that country. So, it's an argument, but it's a bit of a straw man as well, right? We need to get into it and really see whether we can make it work and all of that. But it's a suggestion.
Yeah, please, we have an audience question.
I think what you are essentially asking for is a sovereign wealth fund.
Yes.
And there are very well-defined models of how a sovereign wealth fund can be structured, right? And recently, Montek Singh Ahluwalia and Raghuram Rajan also suggested the same. So I think just to kind of make it more concrete, the question is, how do you structure a sovereign wealth fund that will invest in tech space, right? And then, I mean, there's the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, like NIIF, where the government has 49% holding, right? Because if it becomes more, then obviously a lot of the restrictions that applies to the state in general applies. So if you have 49% or below, then you can act more with more flexibility. So I think essentially the discussion should be channeled along the lines of how do you create a sovereign wealth fund or a similar fund to tackle the problem of patient capital in tech innovation sector. I think that's how it should be probably framed.
That's fair.
On point.
I mean, I don't have an answer. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how to legally structure this entity or which law might need to be changed to figure out what flexibility needs to be given.
Just a comment, I thought.
No, but I agree with you. You're right.
Excellent suggestion.
Brilliant suggestion. Do we have any more audience questions? So we'll take a few from. So for Asha ma'am, while the access to digital tools are growing, it is not equitable. How do we bridge the gender digital divide? That'll be the last question.
We are running out of time.
Right.
Did you say gender?
Gender.
Gender. I think, well, there's a recognition now, strong recognition both in Silicon Valley and here in Bangalore, that women-led startups are thoroughly underrepresented. And what we've started seeing, at least in the Bay Area, is that there's literally almost certain percentages being allocated for women-led venture capital funds. There's an explosion of those now, including women-led startups. So it used to be that there would be probably 1% a couple of years ago. It's beginning to inch up to 8, 9, 10% of women-led startups. So it's happening. It's growing there, and I think it's going to happen in India. I'm seeing a lot of women-led startups coming from India, even into Y Combinator and things like that. So it's happening. I'm quite sanguine about that.
And we even have other initiatives such as Women in Tech, and we have the Google Scholarship for just specifically for women as well.
Yeah, there's an Anita Borg Foundation, for example, in Bangalore, fantastic women-led startups that they support.
A small reality check in the middle of all this. The workforce participation rate for women in India has fallen below 20% for the first time in many years, and now it's 16%. Our women don't work, or rather they don't get paid work. They're mostly doing unpaid work, so they have no income, so they can't borrow, so they can't grow. That requires a lot more grassroots initiatives, but yeah, we've got a lot of problems to solve.
But one of that would be time. We are out of time. Thank you. Thank you, Asha ma'am. Thank you, Sahil.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the great conversation.
A.m. Indian Standard Time. The theme for tomorrow is Technology and Innovation, Roadmap to Sustainability and Inclusion. We will have 15 sessions on a wide range of issues like cloud governance, global retail supply chains, fighting future pandemics, and nuclear non-proliferation. Thank you and see you tomorrow.